Good afternoon, and welcome to the second day of the World Prosperity Forum here in Zurich, organized by the Heartland Institute. I should also say good morning to all of you joining us via live stream. This is the second day of 5 days organized by Heartland on the same week, during the same days, same times as Davos World Economic Forum taking place just down the street, about 150 kilometers from here. Welcome to all of you. My name is Alvino-Mario Fantini. I'm the editor-in-chief of the European Conservative magazine and news portal. And I'm here to speak to you about one of the many boondoggles and multilateral structures, entities that threatens our freedoms, not just in Europe, but around the world. Specifically, I'm here to speak about the EU. As I said, I'm the first of 5 speakers. I'll be followed by former President of the Czech Republic, Václav Klaus, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Liz Truss, Istvan Kiss, the President of the Danube Institute, and Ellen Krieger-Fantini, the Deputy Editor of the European Conservative. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues, it's a thrill for me to speak to you at this World Prosperity Forum, which I hope will be repeated every year from now on to counter the message and the narrative being pushed by Davos. This week in Davos, the high priests of globalism have once again convened to sip champagne, sketch utopian blueprints on their silk napkins, and declare what you shall own, how you shall live, and above all, what you shall be permitted to say. This week, we answer them with the roar of free men and women who refuse to be their subjects. But first, let me take you back to a younger version of myself, still an idealistic young man with more hair and fewer scars, still convinced that the world could be mended by good intentions. Decades ago, I plunged headfirst into the world of international development and energy policy, working on projects financed and implemented by various multilateral bureaucracies. I did so not because I agreed necessarily with their purpose, quite the opposite. I wanted to see the globalist machine in action, up close, and understand its inner workings. And what I discovered was sobering. Behind the glossy reports and noble rhetoric lay inefficiency, mind-numbing bureaucracy, and an unmistakable sense of entitlement. Financial and political pressures were used to impose narrow agendas and to force states and nations into ideological obedience and policy compliance. Local communities and sovereign governments were told their own knowledge and priorities and sovereignty did not count. For me, it was a reminder that freedom is not a gift bestowed by some authority. Freedom is claimed, fought for, by those who refuse to be dictated to. Right now, that same kind of refusal is rising across Europe and around the world. But here in Europe, where the EU's aggressive, freedom-crushing, and manipulative agenda has pushed citizens to the breaking point, it is fueling new parties. The EU's agenda is one that demands exposure, confrontation, and ultimately defeat. And as we rally here this week to rattle the cages of leftist globalism, I repeat what I and others have argued elsewhere. We must deconstruct the global administrative state and dismantle the supranational overreach of the EU. Let's begin by remembering that the EU was born from the ashes of World War II, envisioned by men of profound faith who sought peace through cooperation, not coercion. Robert Schuman, Alcide de Gasperi, Konrad Adenauer, these founding fathers, deeply influenced by their Catholic faith, imagined a community of sovereign nations collaborating freely, not a centralized superstate devouring autonomy. how far we have fallen. Today's EU has deviated grotesquely from this vision, morphing into a supranational monstrosity. Now, a pivotal figure in this transformation was Jacques Delors, president of the European Commission from 1985 to 95. Delors, a committed French socialist, not a coincidence, played a key role in laying the groundwork for the Maastricht Treaty, which established the euro and expanded EU powers. Delors exploited favorable political conditions to push for centralization, shifting power from national capitals to Brussels, thus creating a powerful technocratic machine. And he turned the dream of balanced cooperation into a centralized bureaucracy, becoming himself, in a way, a new Caesar. Now, this is an apt comparison. Belgian historian David Engels has astutely observed that the EU, much like the late Roman Empire in its decline, is now hastening its own decline through relentless over-centralization and the erosion of national diversity, replacing the rich mosaic of European nations with a homogenized technocratic order that ultimately weakens the very civilization it claims to protect. The Eurosceptic Bruges Group, founded in 1989, has also long argued that the EU has evolved into an anti-democratic entity that prioritizes elite control over popular will. In her famous 1988 Bruges address, Lady Thatcher, who inspired the Bruges Group, warned that attempts to suppress nationhood and concentrate power at the center of a European conglomerate would only wreak damage. How right she was. Let me give you a brief overview of the kinds of damage and the kinds of assaults on economic, national, and intellectual freedom that the EU has produced so far. Well documented elsewhere, the EU undermines economic freedom through a web of regulations that stifle enterprise. There is the notorious Common Agricultural Policy, which consumes 40% or more of the EU budget on subsidies that perpetuate inefficiency and dependency. Family farms, for example, in Poland and Italy, once vibrant stewards of the land, now buckle under nitrogen limits and red tape that favor industrial giants, locking rural communities into cycles of stagnation. Fiscal rules like the Stability and Growth Pact have imposed austerity on nations like Greece and Spain, pushing youth unemployment to 25% and more and eroding financial freedom. The euro itself, once a symbol of unity, has become a straitjacket, stripping countries of monetary sovereignty and forcing painful adjustments that have devastated economies. And then there's the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, hailed as a privacy shield, which has instead become a millstone around the necks of small businesses. Compliance costs for the GDPR average 10,000 euros annually for small and medium enterprises, with some facing burdens of up to €500,000, all while larger corporations like Google and Meta navigate the rules with ease. Such measures only stifle innovation and entrench monopolies. Then there is the EU's misuse of rule of law arguments to punish non-compliant nations. Hungary, as you all know, has faced repeated threats under Article 7 proceedings for policies that prioritize their own national sovereignty. The EU has withheld billions in funds, framing the country's sovereign choices as violations of, quote, European values, a cynical ploy to enforce conformity. Indeed, under Ursula von der Leyen's presidency, the European Commission's overbearing, tyrannical approach has reached new heights. Von der Leyen's public statements have been dismissive of national leaders who resist her vision, framing their resistance as threats to the European project rather than legitimate democratic choices. As our friend and colleague Václav Klaus, who will speak after me, has incisively written, quote, the European Union is a post-democratic and post-political structure that goes against all our values and ideals, end quote. Through regulation, subsidies, monetary control, sanctions, the EU has seized the commanding heights of the economy and has turned what was meant to be a community of free nations into a technocratic machine that dictates what once sovereign peoples decided for themselves. Now, the assault on freedom by the EU does not stop merely at the economic or the political. It reaches into the very realm of thought itself, the realm where dissenting thought and political philosophy breathe. And here, the EU is not merely overreaching, it is committing a slow, deliberate murder of the intellect. The Digital Services Act, the DSA, is the most visible instrument of this crime. It hands Brussels the power to demand that platforms remove content deemed, quote, hate speech, quote, hard to define what that means, or disinformation, also hard to define what that means. And I suppose it depends on your perspective or your political ideology. There are fines of up to 6% or more of global turnover for the non-compliant companies. The result is predictable. Platforms now over-censor preemptively. Conservative voices, like, for example, Eva Vlaardingerbroek, the Dutch influencer, and others, are now deplatformed or shadow banned. And major social media companies are pressured to suppress certain narratives under the guise of fighting foreign interference. This is not safety. This is narrative control. When the state begins to police what may be said, what may be thought, written, or taught, it does not merely restrict speech, it restricts the very possibility of intellectual freedom. Articles, essays, and op-eds that question the dominant narratives on migration, gender, family, or identity are now flagged, reported, and sometimes removed from platforms under the DSA's vague provisions. This is not an accident. It is by design. It is a feature. When Brussels decides what constitutes hate speech, it can decide what constitutes legitimate thought. When Brussels decides that certain ideas are harmful, it is not protecting people, it is protecting power. When Brussels decides that certain books, ideas, or theories are dangerous, it's not safeguarding society, it's safeguarding the regime. A continent that once gave the world the cathedral, the novel, the essay, the university, is now being told what it may contemplate, what it may create, and what it may think. Now, we've seen such a pattern before. In every empire that has feared the free mind. Yesterday, Mark Morano delivered a searing presentation here at the World Prosperity Forum, tracing the long, dark history of elites who have seized control over free peoples by invoking fabricated emergencies and claims of necessity, weaponizing crises to suppress dissent. Rome feared the Christians who spoke of a higher law. In revolutionary France, the Jacobins feared the clergy and the citizens who dared to question their bloodthirsty regime. The Soviets and the Chinese Communist Party feared the artists, the intellectuals, and the poets who refused to lie. And now Brussels fears the Europeans who refuse to conform. The more they censor, the more they reveal their own fragility. This is why the fight for intellectual freedom is not peripheral. It is central, and it complements the fight for economic freedom. We cannot win the economic or political battles if we lose the battle for the mind. We cannot defend the family or the nation if we cannot first defend the right to think, to speak, to question, and to create. That is why the EU's assault on intellectual freedom is not just dangerous, it is existential. It's worth recalling briefly that the EU's overreach is also the latest manifestation of a centuries-old pattern of social engineering. Thinkers from diverse ideological backgrounds have long warned us about this. James Burnham, in his seminal The Managerial Revolution in 1941 described how a new class of manager, technocrats and administrators, seized power in modern-day societies, displacing both capitalists and workers with systems of control. The economist Lord Peter Bauer eviscerated the aid industry, calling it a boondoggle that only fostered dependency and fueled corruption rather than real growth. And even the left-leaning progressive scholar Arturo Escobar has argued that the entire concept of international development and what he called the problematization of poverty, taking poverty and turning it into a mathematical problem to be solved by applying certain formulas. Even he has seen that the aid industry only justifies state intervention and control by globalist elites. All these voices, conservative, libertarian, progressive, have converged on a single truth, that multilaterals, like the EU, cloak everything they do in the language of, quote, democratic values, quote, sustainability, quote, inclusion, and shared progress, but are staffed themselves by elitists and treat national sovereignty as an obstacle. And they treat local traditions as anachronisms to be replaced through modernization. We must heed such warnings, and we should seek to dismantle all these multilateral structures, including the EU. Now, much like its counterparts, the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, the EU embodies the detached, elitist mentality that dominates global governance. Its staff function as a sort of bureaucratic aristocracy. They are a privileged class of officials who enjoy lavish, largely tax-free perks at the expense of the European taxpayer. A few examples of what makes them feel so entitled. European commissioners pocket nearly 26,000 euros monthly, largely untaxed. Directors general at the EU earn 18 to 22,000 per month untaxed. Parliamentarians take home more than 10,000. Plus, listen to these supplements. They receive tax-free housing allowances, family subsidies, business class travel, untaxed office expenses, meal vouchers, company cars, petrol cards, private healthcare, education grants for elite schools, and pensions of 70% of their final salary. In short, the staffers of the EU and other multilaterals represent the very divide that has been fueling the populist nationalist revolt against globalism, from Brexit to Trump's America First pushback to Milei's revolt against Argentine bureaucracy. To be sure, the EU's anti-democratic tendencies and bureaucratic excesses have not gone unchallenged. There have been numerous works over the years that have analyzed with great rigor the shenanigans of the EU. There's Bernard Connolly's The Rotten Heart of Europe, such a great title. There's The Great Deception by Christopher Booker and Richard North. These works chronicle how the European project was built on deliberate misrepresentations, what we might call lies. Former Dutch MEP Dirk Jan Eppink's book, Empire of Little Kings, pulled back the curtain on the European Parliament's inner workings, revealing a vicious nest of petty fiefdoms far removed from the concerns of average European citizens. And President Václav Klaus's book, Europe, The Shattering of Illusions, offered an eloquent, robust condemnation of the EU as an anti-democratic construct. I'm sure we'll hear more on that later today. All these voices have carefully documented the EU's freedom-crushing agenda. But fortunately, we are also very, very lucky to have statesmen willing to push back. Let's recall Javier Milei's appearance at Davos 2 years ago, where he boldly proclaimed the following, quote, "The Western world is in danger because those who are supposed to defend the values of the West are co-opted by a vision of the world that inexorably leads to socialism and thereby to poverty." End quote. Milei's call to embrace free enterprise capitalism as, quote, "the only morally desirable system to end global poverty," end quote, resonates powerfully with our fight. And in his own address at the World Economic Forum in 2020, President Trump offered a forceful rejection of the globalist elite's climate agenda, declaring the following, quote, "To embrace the possibilities of tomorrow, we must reject the perennial prophets of doom and their predictions of the apocalypse," end quote. I hope Greta Thunberg and all her acolytes are listening. This was a pointed rebuke of the Davos crowd's agenda and their calls for more regulation, and it perfectly captured the growing resistance to globalism. One more reference. Yesterday, our friend Harold Bilimsky delivered an unflinching address here at the World Prosperity Forum, exposing what he called, quote, "the dark forces of Davos," end quote, and summoning the forces of light, the rising tide of patriots, conservatives, and freedom-loving citizens across Europe who refuse to surrender their heritage, their economies, and their right to self-determination to unelected overlords. Happily, it's not just our statesmen who are pushing back against the globalist mentality. Patriotic citizens are fighting back too. Indeed, a grassroots freedom movement is rising and spreading across Europe and the world. My wife, Fantini, will speak later today on this European freedom movement, and other speakers too will delve into its growing strength. And as I said at the beginning, you'll hear from former President Václav Klaus and former Prime Minister Liz Truss about their own experiences facing their own deep states in their countries. I'll leave the further inspiring details to them. Let me conclude with the following. To win this battle for the soul of Europe and the future of freedom, we must move from diagnosis to decisive action. And here are a few minor suggestions. First, I think we must amplify the truths about how the EU operates and expose their lies. As an editor and publisher, I've featured voices that dismantle the EU's falsehoods, piece by piece, argument by argument, just as my early journalism once unmasked the exaggerations of climate alarmism. We must make it impossible for the Brussels narrative to go unchallenged. Every deception must have a rebuttal. Second, we must forge coalitions across borders and factions. Look to the examples of Orban, Meloni, Trump, and Millet, leaders from very different traditions, but they found common ground and common cause in defending national sovereignty. We must build bridges among all those who value freedom so that Eastern Europe's resilience, for example, can link arms with Western populism. Third, we must demand a dramatic, non-negotiable rollback of regulatory burdens and put an end to economic terrorism disguised as global governance. And finally, we must champion concrete policies that deliver real freedom and real prosperity. A few quick examples of this. Demand energy independence through the full use of oil, natural gas, and nuclear power, rejecting the suicidal fantasy of decarbonization. We must wage war on poverty through sweeping tax cuts and deregulation that unleash the creative energies of ordinary people. We should protect liberty by rejecting or pulling out of suffocating international treaties and directives that only bind our nations. And we should harness the fire and passion of the young. They're not afraid to question authority. They're not afraid to speak plainly. They know what's at stake. This is the path forward if Europe is to survive, not as a homogenized superstate, but as a constellation of free, proud, self-governing nations. The hour is late, but people are waking up. And the tide may be finally turning. Let's seize this moment. Let's shatter the dominion of these elites and forge a Europe and a world of free and sovereign nations. Thank you very much.